Hi everybody, it's time for Small Talk 4, a recap of Ezekiel 14, actually 14 through 19, and a discussion of metaphor theory. This part of Ezekiel is very rich in different kinds of metaphor, so I wanted to talk first about a couple preliminary matters, then about metaphor theory, and then to run through some highlights of the text of Ezekiel 14 through 19. As preliminary matters go, the division between 13 and 14 is something that Renz argues for, and you can check on page 72 of Ren's book for his reasoning on dividing it there. But we talked in the last small talk about the linguistic cue there of a double world builder at 14.5, which we had both the elders mentioned and then the Vayhi Devar Adonai mentioned as kind of a double world builder. And that would contribute to the idea that this is a division in the cycle. Renz then has 4 cycles for the first half of the book, 1 through 7, 8 through 13, 14 through 19, and 20 through 24. So I wanted to talk a little bit about metaphor theory, particularly conceptual metaphor theory, because conceptual metaphor provides a good amount of cohesion in the text. Conceptual metaphor is, basically speaking, understanding one thing, which we call the target domain, by correlation with another thing, which we call the source domain. So it's a set of comparisons that get made. It's usually monodirectional. In other words, we go from the source to the target, not from the target to the source. And sometimes, but not always, it can manifest as literary metaphor. A lot of what's happening in Ezekiel, however, happens in the context of literary allegory. So we have sort of metaphorical thinking, but created in a more complicated piece of text formed as an allegory or as a riddle. The comparisons that get made in conceptual metaphor theory are often based on something called the Great Chain of Being, which you can Google that up if you want to see more about it. But basically speaking, it's conceptualizing things on a sliding scale, from the divine to society to human to animal to plant to a complex object and then to a simple object. So we can see this sort of scaling that goes on. It's not the only way that comparisons are made, but it's quite a frequent way to do it, and it's usually pretty powerful. So in the notes, you'll notice that I've put some of the phrases into small caps, and that's a conceptual metaphor, cognitive metaphor way of acting as a shorthand for certain recurring patterns that occur in conceptual metaphor. So number 1, we have the idea of God as a person. Okay, the divine is a person, acts like a person, and typically literary figure-wise, that would be called anthropomorphism. So you're already probably familiar with the conceptual metaphor that stands behind what we would call an anthropomorphism. Another one that's very common particularly in prophets, is the idea of society as a person. Here we have, in Ezekiel 18, we have Israel portrayed as a man. And then in Ezekiel 16, Israel is portrayed as a whore. Okay, so a very particular type of human being. But that refers not to a single human, but to all of the people in the society. Society as a plant is another one that appears frequently in Scripture and in Ezekiel. For example, Israel is the useless vine in chapter 15. It appears also quite often in prophecy as a whole. Both society as a person and society as a plant are called complex metaphors because there's a lot of comparison that can go on beyond just simply one-to-one comparing the society to a plant. For example, plants grow, they flourish, they die, they can be killed, they can be useful, they can be useless, they can be oh my goodness, what else? They can be provide food, they can provide shade, so forth and so on. So all of those aspects of plantness could be taken off and compared to aspects of society. Is a society flourishing or is it dying? Is a society providing cover for something, or is it just purely useless in that way? And so because these are taken from nature and from common things that people would normally know about, they become very useful ways of thinking about things. Now, some simpler metaphors that we use very often is the idea of people are plants. Okay, and also the idea that people are animals. And in the chapter about the great eagle, we have an example of that in Ezekiel 17. So let's just go through a few points for each of these chapters. There's so much in here, and I was going over my notes going what to say. There's just tons. A lot of it you're going to get from your reading and from your forum writing, but I want to highlight a few things that I think are really important here. So we'll do the raise up a few issues. Ezekiel 15, this is the allegory of the useless vine, and the genre here is that of a riddle. And a riddle is common in ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature. Okay, we see here the society as a plant metaphor that underlies this allegory or the riddle. The inhabitants of Jerusalem, the target domain, are compared to a useless, twisted, burned vine, which would be the source domain. And you can go through there and see many points of comparison. The upshot of 15 is that Jerusalem is going to be burned due to her sinful behavior. And so those things are all sort of compressed into this burned plant metaphor. And notice how this more colorful language helps us to sort of understand at a different level, perhaps, what was going on with Jerusalem. It's not only an intellectual sort of way of thinking about it, but it also helps us to look at things in a little more rounded, experiential kind of way. And so looking and attending to these metaphors is another way of reading well, which we were talking about doing when we talked about using more of a text world approach to the text. Okay, so if we looked at this in text world terms, we can see that we would have to sort out. We have some different kinds of objects being mentioned first, and then we have the characters being associated with the objects. So a little bit complicated. It makes you think through the text a little bit and sort of have maybe even a more affective experience with that text. In Ezekiel 16, this is a chapter that could go for an hour of lecture because there's so many important points in here. The upshot of the chapter is that Jerusalem is functioning in the society as a person metaphor. Jerusalem is a harlot. Okay, not only is Jerusalem pictured as a female, which many times cities are pictured as females, but now Jerusalem is pictured as a harlot. And this, in ancient Near Eastern terms, was not a nice place to be. Okay, we see that it was something that happened. A comparison is also evident in Hosea. Hosea actually brings back his straying wife, Gomer, as an act of faithfulness toward her. And also, if you read Jeremiah 2 and 3, we see the idea played out here. The main issue then is a lack of faithfulness, and it's couched in terms of faithfulness to a marital relationship or committed relationship. In this chapter, Ezekiel's language is extremely raw, and if you're reading through it, sometimes I find myself almost wanting to cringe. It's that vivid and that raw. Not necessarily when he talks about idolatry in chapter or verses 15 to 24, but when he gets to the idea of child sacrifice at verses 20 and 22, makes the person want to kind of back up from the text and go, my goodness, what in the heaven's name was going on there? So if you're interested in finding out a little bit more about how the sins of Israel were not casual, they were not simple moral choice, they were complex moral choice and very, very ingrained in the ancient Near Eastern sort of setting of the day where child sacrifice did happen. Unbelievable in a sense to find this in our text, but there it is. So those are some of the things in 16 that are pretty vivid and make this book a little difficult to preach through from front to back. If you were thinking of doing a expository series on prophets, there are probably other places a person would go first, simply because this would require an awful lot of handling of historical details as opposed to finding things that we can identify with nowadays. Ezekiel 16, 35 to 63 is a long section of the text, and it's called a Reeve Oracle. It's a shorthand term for a covenant lawsuit. In other words, God's covenant with Israel is a setup where in certain cases the laws of the covenant would allow for the bringing of a lawsuit between the people and God. Now, how much of this is actually sort of metaphorical and a way of talking about getting through this issue, and how much of it is actually based on the technical law is a question that we could ask. One of the interesting things in there is that there was a punishment for adultery in the book of Deuteronomy, at Deuteronomy 22, 23 through 24. And this is where we end up with a pretty sticky wicket, because if people were caught in adultery, they could be stoned to death. And here is where there are some correlates in the present day real world that I find to be extremely uncomfortable. And so when people do bring up, well, the Old Testament was pretty, had the same kinds of things in it, indeed it did. And so we need to think about how, as Christians, looking at this book and looking at that particular law code, which would allow for people to be stoned for adultery, how does that then get played out in modern day interpretation? Come to think of it, that might make a really good topic for a forum post at some time. Probably not this term, but in thinking about how to deal with some of these more tricky parts of the Old Testament. However, I think if we keep in mind here that the discussion centers around this quasi-metaphorical lawsuit between the people and God, that the punishment for the adultery being stoning in Deuteronomy is something that also comes forward as justification for destruction of the city, as opposed to stoning human beings. So there's something that could be thought of there. Now, the comparison between Samaria, Sodom, and the addressees, current addressees, is also based on the society as a person metaphor. We have sisters, we have your sister did this, and because of that, this is going to happen. So all of this is really rich language. It's not simple narrative like you might expect it to be. It's more complicated than that, and requires our mental toggling back and forth between the society and this picture we're building up in our mind of unfaithful sisters and so forth. 16 is difficult. It's long. It's a chapter that I would recommend that you do read carefully, and also prior to bringing that to the table for a Christian audience today, to really think through what are some of these bigger moral questions that are going to come up, and how are we going to answer that. And I think the focus on the idea that God is just when he fulfills his own law. If he promises that you will live because of X, Y, and Z, and people do P, Q, and Y, then God is just to follow through with his decision to render the judgment. But that's very hard words. It's very hard words. And that's not necessarily something that goes down completely well when we're looking at New Testament theology. So again, we're looking at stair-stepping some of these things and figuring out how to present them not only to ourselves, but to others. In Ezekiel 17, we have the allegory of the eagle, the vine, and the cedar. And this one is so visual. It's very easy for me. I'd love to be outside. I'd love to be in a mountain or even in an area where you see eagles, which we do see close here where I go running, eagles up in the top of trees and things. So this is easy for me to picture. It's almost harder to take those things and make the proper connection with what's going on. But each of the things has a corollary, and I would recommend to you to go ahead and look at how the plant, the animals, and the people all end up being described in the connections within the book itself, because the author has created the allegory or the sort of picture here, but also then goes on to explain who's who in there. And so it's not random. It's not even as sort of non-porous as some of the stuff in Daniel where you're going, who was that? Who was that? Feet of clay kind of thing. Each one is explained in here. So we have a good, easy to read kind of piece, and it's very fascinating. Now, in Ezekiel 18, we're dealing with that, of course, in the forum this week. 2 points that I want to bring out, and you probably have discovered on your own preparing for the forum. First of all, the covenant itself is still corporate. Okay, so the talk of individuals, the talk of if a man, and the seemingly very individualistic sort of thing, really needs to be painted against the backdrop of a covenant that is corporate. It's the whole people. So, because it's easy enough to say, well, some people probably were doing good in the midst of what's going on there. They're all still being judged, right? And so the idea that the covenant is for all the people, the onus of responsibility seems to fall with the leaders. Okay, so the leaders, when the leaders choose bad, it goes back down onto the people themselves. And so we have a kind of hierarchy there. But nonetheless, the whole thing is corporate. So that's one aspect to keep in mind. The second is this discussion of a new heart and a new spirit. Pardon me. We see a similar type of language in Jeremiah 31:30. Okay, so their old heart, their old spirit were not doing what they needed to do. And we pop back in with a new heart and new spirit here. Pardon me again. So we see justice has a goal, and the goal is the restoration between God and his people.